Stories have shaped our world for centuries. From ancient myths to timeless fables, from spine-chilling horror to heartwarming tales, each one carries a piece of history, wisdom, and wonder. Welcome to Great World Stories, the channel where literature comes to life. Here, we explore legendary stories and mysteries from around the world, unravel their meaning, and bring them to you in a way you've never experienced before. Whether you love classic literature, enjoy thrilling storytelling, or just want to discover something new, this is the place for you. So, grab a cup of coffee, hit that subscribe button, and let's journey into the world's greatest stories, one tale at a time. Subscribe now and let the stories begin.
The Dancing Plague of 1518. Chapter 1, The First Step. In the sweltering summer of 1518, the city of Strasbourg lay restless under an oppressive sun. The cobbled streets, lined with timber-framed houses and bustling market stalls, radiated heat as the townspeople went about their daily lives. Farmers bartered their goods, blacksmiths hammered at their anvils, and children darted through the alleyways, their laughter echoing against the stone walls. But beneath the ordinary rhythms of life, an unease loomed, one that none could yet explain. It began on a morning like any other. The sun had barely crested the horizon when a woman named Frau Troffea stepped out into the square. She was a modest woman, neither particularly young nor old, known for her quiet demeanor. But on this day, something was different. Without music, without reason, she began to dance. At first, the movement was subtle, a simple tapping of her feet against the stones, a swaying of her hips. Passers-by paused, bemused by the sight. Perhaps she was celebrating something? A wedding, a birth? Yet there was no joy in her expression. Her face, pale and tense, was set in grim determination, as though compelled by an unseen force. As the hours stretched on, Frau Troffea did not stop. Sweat soaked her clothes, her breath came in ragged gasps, but she continued, her feet never ceasing. Concerned townspeople approached, calling her name, pleading with her to rest, but she gave no response. By nightfall, she collapsed from exhaustion, only to rise again at dawn and resume her relentless dance. Word spread quickly through Strasbourg. The bishop's clerks, the merchants, the city officials, all spoke in hushed tones of the woman who could not stop dancing. Some whispered of madness, others of divine punishment. The city physicians, steeped in the medical theories of Galen and Hippocrates, suggested an imbalance of the humors, perhaps an excess of hot blood. But no one had an answer, and as days passed, the horror deepened. By the end of the week, others had joined her. First a handful, then dozens. Men, women, and even children found themselves gripped by the same compulsion, their bodies twisting and convulsing in unrelenting motion. Some wept as they danced, their limbs moving against their will. Others cried out in pain, their feet blistered and bleeding, yet unable to stop. City officials convened in an emergency session. What could be done? How could they contain this madness before it consumed the entire town? Theories abounded. Was it a curse? A punishment from God? Or something more sinister, something lurking beneath the fragile surface of their world? As the bells of the cathedral tolled, marking another long night of fevered dancing, one thing became certain, the plague had begun, and Strasbourg would never be the same. Chapter 2, The Spreading Curse. The madness grew with each passing day. Where once the dancing had been confined to a single woman, now the marketplace, alleyways, and even the steps of the cathedral teemed with frenzied bodies. The afflicted moved as if under a spell, limbs jerking, feet stomping, their faces twisted in exhaustion and despair. Some collapsed, only to be roused by an unseen force, compelled to move again. The clergy was the first to issue warnings. Bishop Johann von Staupitz declared the plague a punishment for sin, a divine reckoning upon the city. He called for mass prayer and fasting, urging the people of Strasbourg to seek absolution. Priests gathered in the cathedral, chanting psalms, swinging censers of incense meant to ward off evil spirits. But outside, in the streets, the dancers did not stop. City officials, desperate for a solution, turned to the physicians. The town's leading doctor, Meister Jacob, dismissed the idea of divine punishment. He insisted that the afflicted suffered from an imbalance of humors, a surplus of heat in the blood. The cure, he suggested, was to allow them to dance the madness out of their bodies. And so, in an unprecedented decision, the city sanctioned the construction of a great wooden stage in the marketplace. Musicians were hired, drums and pipes filled the air, and the dancers were given space to move. It was a decision born of desperation, and it proved disastrous. The music did not soothe the afflicted, it fed their compulsion. With rhythm guiding them, the dancing grew wilder. Some fell into fits of convulsions, others tore at their clothes, wailing in agony. The plague was no longer a spectacle, it was an epidemic. Merchants, travelers, and noblemen visiting Strasbourg carried word of the bizarre affliction to nearby towns. Fear spread faster than the plague itself. Some believed Strasbourg was cursed, doomed by an ancient sin buried beneath its stones. Others whispered of secret cults, of witches who had summoned a demon to torment the city. Superstition gripped the region, and as panic set in, the city teetered on the edge of chaos. The mayor, desperate to prevent further escalation, ordered the closure of public spaces. The marketplace was emptied, the great wooden stage torn down. Guards patrolled the streets, warning citizens to remain indoors. But even behind locked doors, the people of Strasbourg could hear the ceaseless stomping of feet, the cries of those trapped in their own tortured dance. And then, as if fate itself wished to test them further, the first deaths were reported. A man, young and strong, collapsed in the square. His body was slick with sweat, his heart pounding against his ribs. He gasped once, then fell still. Before the day was out, 2 more followed. The plague was no longer just a mystery, it was a killer. The city's fate now hung in the balance, and as the sun set over the blooded feet and broken bodies of the dancers, Strasbourg braced for what was still to come. Chapter 3: The Grip of Madness. The death toll climbed. The once bustling streets of Strasbourg became a macabre stage, littered with the bodies of those who had danced themselves to death. Their faces frozen in expressions of agony, their hands clenched in rigid spasms. Those who still lived suffered greatly, limbs bruised and battered, their feet raw and bleeding. Yet they could not stop. The city, paralyzed with fear, sought answers wherever they could be found. Some turned to folk healers, who mixed herbal remedies and whispered incantations meant to break the spell. Others sought exorcisms, believing the dancers were possessed by malevolent spirits. But no cure worked. The afflicted remained trapped in their ceaseless torment. A group of desperate officials traveled to the Benedictine monastery in the Black Forest, seeking counsel from the revered abbot. After days of deliberation, the monks advised the city to take drastic action. The afflicted, they said, must be removed from Strasbourg. A pilgrimage to a holy shrine, far from the city's cursed streets, was their only hope. And so, under the cover of night, the dancers were gathered. Carted away in wagons, their bodies convulsing with emotions they could not control, they were taken to the shrine of St. Vitus, the patron saint of dancers. There, the monks prayed over them, offered them blessed bread, and pleaded for divine intervention. For the first time in weeks, the dancing slowed. The people of Strasbourg held their breath. Would the nightmare finally end? Chapter 4: The Journey to Salvation. The decision was made, those afflicted by the dancing plague would be taken to the shrine of St. Vitus in the hopes of divine intervention. The procession was a pitiful sight, men and women, their feet raw and bleeding, stumbling forward in a trance, unable to resist the compulsion to move. Some had to be carried, their bodies spent from days of ceaseless motion. Others, too weak to continue, collapsed along the way, left in the care of concerned onlookers. Father Anselm, a priest from Strasbourg who had volunteered to lead the pilgrimage, watched over the afflicted with both fear and pity. He had read of past incidents of uncontrollable dancing, but none as prolonged or as severe as this. He muttered prayers under his breath as he walked, clutching his rosary. Lord, grant them peace. The journey was treacherous. The summer heat bore down upon them, and the roads were rough. Some villagers who witnessed the procession whispered superstitions, crossing themselves as if afraid the madness might be contagious. Others offered water and bread, though the dancers hardly paused to eat. At night, the group camped under the stars. The afflicted did not rest, they continued their frantic, jerking movements, their bodies swaying to music that no one else could hear. Those who tried to hold them still found it impossible. The force driving them was stronger than exhaustion, stronger than pain. Only when their bodies finally gave out did they collapse into a feverish sleep, only to resume dancing upon waking. As they neared the monastery of St. Vitus, Father Anselm prayed that the stories were true, that the saint's blessing would be enough to lift the curse. He looked upon the dancers, their faces hollow with suffering, and knew that if this did not work, there was nothing else that could save them. The bells of the monastery tolled in the distance, signaling their arrival. A flicker of hope sparked in the priest's chest. If ever there was a place for miracles, it was here. Chapter 5: The Saint's Mercy. The weary procession of afflicted dancers arrived at the shrine of St. Vitus, nestled deep in the hills beyond Strasbourg. The monastery loomed before them, its towering stone walls promising solace, or at the very least, an end to their ceaseless torment. The monks, draped in simple robes, awaited them with solemn expressions. They had heard of the affliction that gripped Strasbourg and had prepared for their arrival. Each dancer was led inside the chapel, where the scent of incense and melting wax filled the air. The monks whispered prayers, pleading for St. Vitus to intercede. Holy water was sprinkled over the afflicted, their bodies trembling as if caught between two forces, one compelling them to move, the other willing them to stop. Some wept, some collapsed, but all remained under the grip of the mysterious plague. The monks took a different approach than the physicians and city officials. Rather than forcing the dancers to exhaust themselves, they guided them into a slow, deliberate ritual. Chanting hymns, they encouraged the afflicted to step in time with the sacred rhythm. A controlled, purposeful dance, one meant to redirect whatever force had ensnared them. The monks believed that if the dancers could regain control, they could break free. Days passed, and gradually, the convulsions eased. Some of the afflicted fell into deep, dreamless sleeps, some for the first time in weeks. Others, upon waking, no longer felt the compulsion to move. The curse, or sickness, or whatever it had been, seemed to lift. The first dancer to be freed was a young girl, no older than 15. She had barely spoken since the beginning of the plague, but when she finally opened her mouth, she uttered a single word: quiet. A hush fell over the chapel. The monks exchanged glances, uncertain of what it meant, but they knew that it was a sign the madness was breaking. One by one, the afflicted were released from the grip of the plague. By the end of the week, only a handful remained. They were weak, their bodies bruised and battered, but they were free. The monks sent word back to Strasbourg: the saint had granted mercy. As the survivors made their way home, a solemn truth settled upon them. Though the nightmare had ended, the scars, both physical and mental, would remain. What had caused the dancing plague? Some still whispered of divine punishment, others of a sickness that defied explanation. Theories would continue to circulate for centuries to come, but for those who had lived through it, only one thing mattered: they had survived. The city of Strasbourg, forever changed, would never forget the summer of 1518, when its streets became a stage for a dance of suffering, mystery, and ultimately, redemption. Epilogue: the mystery endures. Historians and scholars would spend centuries debating the cause of the dancing plague of 1518. Some argued it was mass hysteria, a psychological affliction born from the stress of famine and disease. Others theorized that ergot poisoning, caused by a toxic mold growing on rye, had induced hallucinations and convulsions. But no single explanation could fully account for the scale and persistence of the event. What is known is that the plague eventually disappeared, never to return with such ferocity. Similar outbreaks were recorded in medieval Europe, but none matched the horror of Strasbourg's ordeal. The story of the dancing plague remains one of history's greatest mysteries, a testament to the strange and inexplicable forces that sometimes grip the human mind and body. And though centuries have passed, the question still lingers: what truly made them dance? Please like and subscribe for more interesting great stories and mysteries.